Well, ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues, good evening and welcome to this Australasian Catholic Coalition for Church Reform webinar with Bishop Shane Mackinlay. My name is Genevieve Jacobs. I'm a journalist and broadcaster and I'll be moderating our conversation this evening. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the places where we gather this evening. I'm on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, as is Francis Sullivan, who will join us towards the end. Bishop Mackinlay joins us from the lands of the Dja Dja Wurrung people. I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging and commit myself to ongoing acts of reconciliation. Bishop Mackinlay, the Bishop of Sandhurst in Victoria, which is centred on Bendigo, is one of the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference representatives at the Synod meeting in Rome. He's about to depart, but before he does so, he will reflect for us on his hopes and expectations for the October meeting and, of course, the implications for the Church in Australia. This pivotal point for the Church is, of course, particularly relevant for all those of us who are interested in renewal and reform. You're going to hear directly from Bishop Mackinlay shortly, and we'll follow with conversation in which you can participate via the Q&A function. And please notice the Q&A function, not the chat function on your Zoom meetings. And I'll weave those questions into our conversation. Although I may not necessarily get to every single one, I'll honour their intention to the best of my ability. And please, let's make this a respectful and a thoughtful conversation with questions that are useful for everyone who's watching and participating this evening. Following the conversation, I'll hand over to Francis Sullivan to summarise the evening's discussion before we close. But before we begin, let's reflect and ask for wisdom for ourselves, for the Church, and for Bishop Shane with the words of St. Thomas Aquinas on wisdom. Give me, Lord, a watchful heart that no stray thought might distract me from you. Give me a noble heart that no unworthy affection might pull me down. Give me a just heart that will not be divided by any dark intention. Give me a strong heart that will not be broken by any tribulation. Give me a free heart that will not follow any violent desire. Give me, Lord God, a mind to know you, diligence to seek you, wisdom to find you, a life to please you, perseverance to wait faithfully for you, and the trust that will finally embrace you. Bishop Mackinlay, with those words, over to you.
Thank you very much, Genevieve. Sorry, I'm mucking myself up already.
You're not the first person to do that, so just go ahead in any case.
It's because I'm trying to share the screen, and as I said earlier, multitasking. I kid myself sometimes that I can, but I really can't. And I'd like to congratulate and thank the Australasian Catholic Coalition for Church Reform and Garratt Publishing on their initiative in arranging this series of seminars, this series of webinars. I've subscribed to each of them. So I must admit my timetable has meant I've generally watched them in replay rather than live. But it reflects, as you can see on the screen there, the very clear statement by Pope Francis that this synod doesn't begin at the beginning of October when the first General Assembly begins. It began 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, when the consultations began. This whole process of consultation and reflection that we have all been involved in is part of the synod itself. This is not just a synod that's about a meeting in Rome. This is a synod that's about a process and an engagement of the whole church throughout the world. So I'll talk for about 15 minutes and then hand it back to Genevieve, and we'll engage in a discussion from there. And I thought it would be helpful to give a bit of information that has only really become clear for us participants in the Synod over the last few weeks about what's actually going to happen during the General Assembly, to the extent that we're aware of that, and put that in the context of the Instrumentum Laboris and the overall process of this 3-year journey. So, and looking at the process, it's worth being alert to the evolution that's happened as the process has been underway. Some of you might remember this timeline, and I think the evolution is very healthy, and we're continuing to see it as a real learning from the engagement and the way that the process is playing out. In May 2021, this is what the timeline looked like, and don't be too concerned about the detail of that. It was already extraordinarily ambitious to begin with a consultation of the whole world, and then gradually to synthesize that at diocesan level, at national level, continental, and then draw it together into an instrumentum laboris and a general assembly. What that does is a fairly linear process, an extraordinary process of synthesizing and distilling, but relatively linear. And incidentally, the people who look at these things say that the engagement in that process has been the biggest, the largest engagement of a group of people in any process in the history of humanity. So it's something we can be very proud of and moved by, I think, to be part of something that's so significant. Anyway, this was May 2021. 18 months later, there was a new timeline that appeared. It wasn't announced, and in some ways it looks similar, but the differences really matter. So this is October of last year, 2022. In some ways, it looks still to be linear and gradually progressing from the local to the meeting in Rome. But in fact, it's more complicated than that. A second assembly has been added, the one in October next year. But there's also this circular process that's been included, this process of what has been called in horrible Vatican speak restitution, but an idea of restoring to people what has been received from them. And so the most significant spot where we've seen that so far is in this stage of after the national documents were all contributed from around the world, the drawing together into a universal document that drew on all of those, that collated them, and then offered them back to us for reflection and further consultation to inform the continental assemblies. This document that I'm sure many of you have read, Enlarge the Space of Your Tent. If you haven't read it, it's an astonishing document, really. Many people, when they read it, said, well, it's a Vatican document I can understand. It's at an accessible length. And it was a wonderful thing for people to recognise their voice, that their voice had been heard and included. And I heard this not just from people around Australia, but from other parts of the world, but then also to hear people from other parts of the world and to have their voice to complement, to affirm, to perhaps bring a different perspective from what we had ourselves. So listening to one another, as well as being assured that we were being heard. And then we have the Instrumentum Laboris, which I'll talk about a bit more shortly. And then we'll have the first session, and then another return to all the churches right throughout the world in the outcomes of the second session, of the first session, before we gather again for the second session next year. The other thing I'd mention about this document for the continental stage is in encouraging you to go and look at it or to revisit it if you've already looked at it. There's some beautiful parts in it, but one of the really beautiful things is the whole way that the image of the tent and enlarging the tent, that very evocative image of a tent that gives protection and shelter, that you can enter from any direction, the way that that's reflected on. So the whole quote from Isaiah talks not just about the tent cloth, but also about lengthening your ropes and making firm your pegs. And in the reflection on that in this document, it talks about the tent cloths, which give a space, which mark out a space for living and shared life, and the need for them to be spread out as a place of welcome and shelter for all who feel called to enter them. But the tent cloths don't just sit there on their own. They rely on ropes that balance tension to keep the tent from drooping. The sort of dialogue that we're invited into is not one that seeks to finally resolve tension, and even less to step away from that. It's one that acknowledges the tension that arises in our community and that we're all familiar with and affected by in different ways at various points, and to find a way of living in that is creative and constructive. And those ropes, of course, are held by pegs, which need to be firmly anchored in the ground. That gives the solidity for the ropes, but also they're different from the foundations for a building. We can remove pegs and move them on to another place when we find ourselves in a different situation or with a different set of needs or a different context. So it reflects on this, on thinking of the church as this tent that needs to stretch out, but also to move. A tent that evokes and reminds us of the tent of meeting that the people of Israel carried with them through the Exodus, a tent in which they experienced God's presence amongst them. One which keeps in balance the different forces and tensions, acknowledges them, listens to them, takes them all seriously. So a wonderful document, well worth revisiting. That document and the reflections on it in the various continental assemblies led to the Instrumentum Laboris, which was published a couple of months ago now, I think. It's a longer document and it's a bit intimidating when you look at it because it is reasonably dense in some spots. So it's worth having an idea of its structure. It's still well worth engaging with. It has three parts. The first part, section A, talks about what it is to be a synodal church, so the idea of synodality itself. Then in section B, there are three sections that talk about different aspects of synodality and take those three key terms that have been the subtitle of this synod right through. They were presented initially as participation, communion, and mission. They've been reordered very deliberately, very intentionally as communion, mission, and participation. Communion reflecting that we must begin by building up our unity and our communion with one another and with God. That's the basis for the mission that we're committed to living that out, a mission that we enter on the day of our baptism. And then it's in that context, the interrelation between communion and mission, that we think most appropriately about how we structure participation, that is, the structures of governance and authority and various institutions. Then in the third part of the Instrumentum Laboris, and the largest part by volume, are 15 worksheets, 5 for each of the sections in section B, in part B. So 5 worksheets for each of communion, mission, and participation. And they go through and really pose questions. It's so different to any Instrumentum Laboris working document, there's the translation of that, any working document for any previous synod, rather than giving a draft of what sort of text might be arrived at. This working document asks questions, and it draws together a long list of questions in each of these areas, questions that have been drawn from the consultation, the enlarge the space of your tent document, and the continental documents particularly. So it does all of that listening, and it presents them to the assembly as questions that the people of God are asking us to consider, to hear, to consider, and to respond to. So filling that out a bit more, there's a foreword, talks about process, context, structure. The characteristics of a synodal church, of synodality, and then these 3 priority issues with 5 worksheets for each of those in the appendix. So section A, the characteristics of a synodal church. What is synodality about? We need to be a listening church. There's a humility. It's a church that's committed to encounter and dialogue, to building up unity in diversity. It's open and welcoming. It understands the relationship between love and truth. So being open and welcoming doesn't just mean that we step aside from our commitment to the gospel and what we're called to in living as faithful disciples. We still proclaim the truth that Jesus calls us to, and we do that in the context always of love. It accepts and manages tensions. Remember those tent ropes holding up the tent cloth. It's aware of the healthy restlessness of incompleteness. We're on the way. We're not going to come up with final answers generally. We're looking for the next step on the way rather than the final definitive solution. We're a prayerful people nourished by liturgy, especially the Eucharist, discerning, committed to what in Australia with the Plenary Council we're used to calling spiritual conversations, but what have been renamed, and having experience trying to translate this term into a couple of other languages. I was at the final assembly of the German Synodal Way. I think they've wisely chosen to call it conversation in the spirit as the methodology, which is a shared prayer with a view to communal discernment, arising from the commitment that in listening to another person in this context, we're listening also for God, for the voice of the Holy Spirit. Now, in taking those in the assembly, we're being asked, according to the Instrumentum Laboris, to clarify and to refine these insights. So as I read it, we'll be asked to reflect on them and to affirm them, to give them a greater status as not just the way that we conduct synods. And I think, given the dramatic changes to the way that this synod is happening, it would be unthinkable for any future synod to operate in a different way. But for the way that we conduct all of our undertakings with one another in the church. Then these 3 priority issues, which are to listen to these, but then to do more than just listening. We've been listening for 2 years now and synthesising and distilling very carefully and very attentively. The part of what we're being asked to do in the assembly, and these quotes are all from the working document, the Instrumentum Laboris, is to reflect on those questions and seek a response in the light of the riches of our tradition, in the light of those pegs that we have put down to hold the tent ropes and the tent cloth. From our theology, canon law, pastoral care, spirituality. To listen deeply, certainly, but also to do that in the context of how do we respond to what we are hearing in a way that proclaims the gospel, similar to that famous quote from Gaudium et Spes, reflecting on the signs of the times and interpreting them in the light of the gospel. What do we have to offer as a church coming out of our rich tradition to respond to these questions? Very interestingly, I think, discerning the level at which it's most appropriate to address each question. So some of these questions, the possibility is being raised of them being referred back to and with authority to address them at a national level, a diocesan level, or indeed at a parish level. So which things really need to be addressed at a universal level? Which things can we appropriately, and taking subsidiarity seriously, address at a different level? Identifying practical steps, including changes in rules, structures, and procedures, and producing further material on which the local churches will be called to pray, reflect, act, and make their own contribution over the year ahead in preparation for the second assembly. So how are we going to do that? And I think they're really important. Those pointers are really important in having an idea that this is a shift in the process, an appropriate shift. It's not a change of direction, but we're at the end of the process of synthesising and distilling, entering a new phase, which is one of reflecting on that and seeking to begin to respond to those questions and concerns and hopes in the light of our tradition, in the light of the gospel. The methodology. So this is information that we've had recently. This is not what we're anticipating. This is what synods used to look like. This is the synod hall full of bishops lined up in all their regalia and in seniority and all facing the front. It's very clear that not only will there be more people, but we will be arranged much more like we were used to at the Plenary Council in Australia, around round tables in the audience hall, the Paul VI audience hall. There's something like 450 direct members, as well as others as facilitators and experts. They're redoing the floor to give it a horizontal, a flat surface. I haven't been in there, but apparently it's on a slope, as you'd imagine, in an auditorium. They're going to make it flat for the duration of the assembly, and very clear that it will be around round tables. And what we'll be doing is it's broken down, the time is broken down into a retreat before we begin, and then 5 segments. The first segment running over, so we get back from retreat on the Tuesday night. We have the prayer vigil the Saturday evening, go that night to retreat, some 500 of us at a place north of Rome. Then when we get back on the Tuesday evening, we have the opening mass Wednesday morning. Wednesday afternoon, we begin. The rest of that week through to Saturday lunchtime, we reflect on part A of the working document. So the overall characteristics of synodality. And then in the 2 weeks that follow, that's roughly 12 days, Monday, 2 sessions each day, all morning, and then from mid-afternoon until early evening on weekdays, and again on Saturday morning. Looks like about 4 days each on part B1, B2 and B3, communion, mission and participation. And then the final week, Monday to Saturday, looking at the steps ahead. That final week, the methodology is not so clear at this stage. I imagine that they're focusing on the parts at the beginning in the earlier stages, and there'll be further work become clear about what happens in that final week as we're drawing together what's happened in the earlier parts. In each of those sessions, at least in the first 4 segments, not necessarily in the 5th, but in the first 4 segments, we'll be in small groups around tables with 12 people and a facilitator. And each of those groups will focus in sessions 2, 3 and 4 on one of the worksheets, B1, the 5, there are 5 for each, so we'll focus on one. We've each been asked to nominate our 3 preferences in terms of which of the worksheets we would prefer to be focusing on. And we'll be in a different group each week. That is for each of those first 4 segments at least, whatever might happen in the 5th session, in the 5th segment. In each of those first 4 segments, and potentially in the 5th segment, but certainly in the first 4, there'll be theological and scriptural input on the broad area that we're looking at. So again, situating us and helping us to connect to the tradition that we're drawing on as we seek to discern a response, a prayerful response to the questions. Then we'll use, and I imagine that there's about 4 days for each of these segments. So I'd imagine we'll use a couple of days for conversation in the spirit about the worksheet that we're focusing on. And then there's a plenary session, perhaps the 3rd day, where the working group reports come back to the whole floor to consider, a bit like at the continental stage, so we can hear what each other are saying, and then there's space for interventions to the whole assembly. And then on the final day of each of these segments, we go back into our working groups to reflect on what we've heard across all of the working groups. And by my count, there'll be something like 35 working groups, something like that. 35, perhaps even nearly 40 working groups. So what have we heard from all of the other groups? And what do we think needs to be picked up from that and the plenary discussion in formulating a final report? So if you like, what we're doing as a whole assembly is something like the process of the spiritual conversations, which have that three-stage process of what do I contribute? What have I heard in my prayer? Then what have I heard other people contributing? And then an open discussion about what do we believe might be carried forward. And quickly, I'll say we're very well represented in Australia. We have 10 members. There are 2 of us who have been elected as members, myself and Archbishop O'Regan from Adelaide. Then another 3 bishops, Archbishop Fisher as a member of the council, who was elected, the council for the Synod, who was elected at the last Synod. That council hasn't previously attended, but is in this one. Bishop Randazzo from Broken Bay, who is president of the Oceania Bishops Federation. And again, those presidents were added quite late as members. Archbishop Costello, who became a part of the coordinating committee earlier this year and has been named as one of the 9 president delegates, or chief people, if you like. John Lakoviak, the chair of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Catholic Council, Trudy Dantas from the National Centre for Pastoral Research, Father Asali Ras, the provincial of the Divine Word Missionaries, a Fijian, but who's lived and worked for many years in Australia, Professor Renee Kohler-Ryan, a theologian at Notre Dame University, and Kelly Padgett, who's the Chancellor of the Diocese of Broken Bay. Also 4 experts and facilitators. Dr. Sandy Cornish, who's at Australian Catholic University, was Director of the Office for Justice and Peace for many years. Brother Ian Cribb, a Jesuit, who particularly facilitated and set up the process of conversations in the Spirit for the Plenary Council. Susan Pascoe, who you heard from in the last one of these webinars, and Father Orm Rush, who's an Associate Professor at Australian Catholic University, a theologian in Brisbane, and an expert on Vatican II and on synodality. So we're very well represented, and by really quality people. It's very exciting, I think, that we're making this contribution. And the final thing I want to finish on, and this is a quote from the document for the Continental Stage, is to remind us again that the point of this synod is not just about what happens at the assembly or about particular outcomes that might come from this. It's about the synodal conversion of the church, about modelling for us and giving us and authorising us and calling us to live synodally and operate synodally more and more in all the structures and processes that we participate in, not just at the universal level, but at our national, diocesan, and indeed parish level. So I'll stop there and hand back to Genevieve to lead our discussion.
Thank you so much, Shane. And look, we do have some questions coming through already in the Q&A function. I'll weave those into our conversation, but please, if you'd like to ask some further questions, put them into the Q&A. Bishop Mackinlay, what do you think that synodality means for the average churchgoer? You've talked a moment ago about the challenge for the church to live synodally. Clearly, this is the buzzword of the moment. Are you sure that ordinary parishioners in the pews understand this concept around which so much has been hung?
No, I'm not. Now, that doesn't mean we stop talking about it. In fact, it's a challenge and a responsibility to keep talking about it and keep talking about it in a way that is accessible to people and talking about it in a way that connects, that makes sense of. So what does this look like? what does it look like when we're acting synodally? One of the things I think, and that I'd point in two directions. One is to the more that we, particularly that document for the continental stage, enlarge the space of your tent, for people to recognise that they have been heard. That's an experience of synodality. That's enormously affirming and encouraging when so many people bring so many experiences of not having been heard, not having been listened to. And then the other thing, I think we're seeing a culture shift, especially in Australia, after the plenary council, and the experience, the transformative experience that has been in both what people have experienced, but also what they expect. So now that doesn't mean it's happening wonderfully in every place, in every situation. But people are seeing in dioceses and in parishes more and more a shift in the way that we engage in our reflection and our decision making. So we're seeing diocesan assemblies and synods, pastoral councils, and in parishes. One of the things I say to parishes as I go around is, if you're voting and getting 51% across the line in your parish council, you're missing the point. That's not operating synodally. You know, this making sure that people have got a voice and that we're working together to discern a way forward that we can all buy into.
Look, certainly you're describing a process there. I've got a number of questions coming through about the end point of all of this, and we might go to that in a moment. But Sean asks, for example, why there's a seeming reluctance in some quarters for diocesan pastoral councils in Australia, and says, I recall the existence of diocesan pastoral councils in the Archdiocese of Hobart and elsewhere around 1971. And I suppose there's certainly been a lot of conversation about the different approaches between dioceses, the different approaches of archbishops to this question, and also a real sense of urgency that model is something that could be taken up nationally. And yet we're not seeing that enthusiasm. We're not seeing that tidal wave towards a representative voice at the diocesan level.
No, we're seeing people inquiring about it, though. I mean, things take time. I've been here in Sandhurst for nearly 4 years, and we only had the first assembly of our diocesan pastoral council in April. And that was very deliberate, that we took the time to reflect on and consult around exactly the sort of structure that we wanted to begin with, at least. You know, it will evolve, and what the agenda should be. And I think that's enormously important. And for me, part of the reason for taking that time was I'd been involved with 3 iterations of diocesan pastoral councils in Ballarat diocese where I was a priest. In one of those, I was the executive officer and helped to co-chair a diocesan assembly and all those things. And we didn't really settle in each of those iterations. None of them really worked. It's not an easy thing to do. And the bigger the diocese, I've got enormous sympathy for the archdiocese, to structure something which genuinely is able to listen to the voice of the people and engage effectively with the other very appropriate and important decision-making structures that are present in a diocese, and give enough time to the issues in front of it to actually make worthwhile contributions. That's really hard. It's really hard. So, and it's challenging enough in a more manageably sized diocese like this. So there's real challenges. That doesn't mean don't do it, of course. But the other thing that we've got is we've got increasing resources around to draw on. There's another document just being published in the last week, commissioned by the bishops, arising out of the implementing the plenary council decisions to try and assist us in having so it analyses the models of diocesan pastoral councils, and there's a complementary document around parish pastoral councils to see what works, where are their struggles, what are the models for even selecting who your participants might be, who your members might be. And bishops and others are drawing on those and very much looking for those sort of resources. we've all committed to holding a diocesan synod in the first 5 years after the plenary council. And one of the things that I would expect that those synods will look towards is what's the right model of a diocesan pastoral council for this diocese? And it will be different in each place, I think, rightly.
Look, I think this goes to many of the questions that are coming through, which are about the voice of people. What you've articulated is a lengthy and a quite elaborate process, obviously drawing here in Australia on the plenary council experience. Many people listening to this webinar would be very familiar with. Do the mechanisms of the Synod genuinely lend themselves to ensuring that the voices of ordinary Catholics you spoke of are heard? I mean, you would be aware, for example, that there's been some major academic work done on how women feel in the church by Dr. Tracy McEwen, by Dr. Kathleen McPhillips. Despite questions in some Catholic media, this was a very robust, very wide-ranging survey with quantitative, qualitative data showing a very strong prevailing feeling that women feel silenced. I looked at the photographs of the bishops and the archbishops, the cardinals, and I thought, it's a room full of men. As they deliberate, how do we expect that women's voices or other marginalised voices in the church, the voices of LGBTQI plus Catholics, others, will genuinely and authentically be conveyed?
Well, I just remind you that that photo of the room full of bishops, that's what used to happen.
Yes, yes.
That's not what we're looking at.
But I think it will nevertheless be a predominantly male.
Oh, yes, sure, sure. But I mean, look at our own members from Australia. There are strong, forthright, articulate women, and a few of the blokes might have heard some of the women's questions and might even have read that report. The other thing I'd say, so I don't think it's as simple as how many women are in the room. Having women in the room clearly matters. That matters enormously, but it's not as simple as having women in the room. The other thing I do is look at the documents, look at the agenda that we've been given, the task that we've been given. It's very clear and enlarge the space of your tent. And it's even clearer in the working document, Instrumentum Laboris. All those questions are explicitly there. Okay. So I think, and that's one of the things that people who read those documents say to me, and with quite some surprise, a pleasant surprise, but nonetheless a surprise, that they feel that their questions have been heard.
And look, I will read the comment from Tim Smythe, who says, Acceptance, Australia's LGBTQI plus Catholic organisation, is celebrating 50 years this year. Pope Francis has sent his greetings to us on this milestone. When can LGBTQIA plus Catholics expect a welcome from Australian bishops?
And again, you'll see that, well, not that explicit question, but there is a question relating to the place of LGBTI Catholics, people in the church, in the Instrumentum Laboris, explicitly. At least one, there might be a couple.
I wondered if you could give us a sense of where you think Australia sits in this global meeting, how loud our voice is, what influences we have, with whom we are aligned. It was interesting to note the distinctions along language groups and to think how that might perhaps influence some of the deliberations. But what's Australia's role in this? Very significant, I think.
And that's largely, I'd say, a recognition of our experience of the plenary council. So we're seeing that, and I don't think it's a question of aligning. This is not, if we end up with lobby groups and parties and that sort of thing, then we're missing the point. We're not actually responding to the call to engage synodally. It's one of the reasons I suspect also that the working groups will change each segment, is so that there's a broader exposure over time to different voices. But the choice of especially Archbishop Costello as one of the president delegates, he was the president of the plenary council, and that follows on his being asked to join the coordinating committee and being part of the group that drafted the Enlarge the Space of Your Tent document, and also the 4 methodology people. each of those has been involved in earlier stages. Susan Pascoe in methodology particularly, Orm Rush in the Theology Commission, Ian Cribb very strongly in the methodology from the angle of conversations in the Spirit. It's very clear from the people who have been chosen, but also from the conversations and the inquiries that are regularly coming to us from the Secretariat for the Synod, keen to draw on the Australian experience, that will have a significant place there.
Well, certainly it was a robust experience here in Australia on many levels, and a highly engaging one. Ben says, I'm very much encouraged by the process and the principles, but I do fear that the ecclesiastical politics, particularly from the US, will impinge on the process. Has the entire Assembly signed up to it?
We'll find out once we get there. And I think that was part of the journey of the Plenary Council, was it. I don't think you'd plan for or hope for a crisis, but one of the things that the crisis did for us was brought a focus and a renewal of a resolution to engage with the process that's. I mean, not that people were half-hearted or were, there was really genuine participation, but there was a shift in the mode of participation. Whether we have a crisis, who knows, over the space of a month, there's plenty of time for that. One of the things that is extraordinary is Pope Francis is not stacking the deck. So there's a whole lot of people who, like myself and Archbishop Pat from Adelaide, who have been elected by or nominated by their bishops' conferences. And then there's people who were chosen from the candidates put forward by, in our case, Oceania. So we were asked to put forward 20 candidates, from whom 10 were chosen. And then there's a whole swag of captain's picks, if you like, where the Pope decides extra people. And that's the heading under which Archbishop Costello has been appointed. And when you look at some of the more conspicuous headline-grabbing conflicts, people from both sides have been nominated. So Pope Francis is very clear. He's not dodging the tensions. He's not trying to stack the deck one way or the other. He's putting us in the room together and saying, I want you to take this process seriously and open yourself, be serious about what you bring, the contribution that you bring, but be serious too about where the process might take you, where the Holy Spirit might take you. And as happened at Vatican II, I mean, I think many of the participants in Vatican II were quite surprised by where they ended up. And of course, this is a 2-year process. That's the other thing to remember. We've got this assembly, and then there's the whole reception stage, where I'm sure there'll be enormous feedback, positively, negatively, both ways, every which way, and then we'll come to the second assembly. So if people are not comfortable with where we end up, there will be plenty of opportunity to make that very clear.
Well, I've got an interesting number of questions from several people about the level of engagement in their diocese with the Synod. Tony writes that he's in a diocese where the Synod hasn't been mentioned at all. And Trish also writes, if one lives in a diocese as we do, where there has been zero official consultation and involvement in the pre-Synod consultation period, what would you recommend for the people of God in that diocese who are feeling that there may have been a dereliction of duty on the part of our ecclesial leadership?
So each of the diocesan reports were asked to include a statement of what consultation they undertook. And those reports are all, I'm pretty sure they're publicly available. So you could go and look at what consultation was actually undertaken. You know, this is one of the most effective accountability measures that we've got in the church, given the structures that we have, is a transparency and a public disclosure of what's happened so that people can be held to account. the process is for everyone, and at each stage of the process, there was scope for people to make individual responses through the national website, and indeed direct to the Vatican, to the Secretariat. And I expect that will be the case again. I'd encourage people to stay aware of what's happening, where certainly I know there are plans for, aside from any broader communications from the Synod itself, for there to be very regular reporting back from the Australian participants. And, the sort of questions that have been raised, local groups don't need permission to engage in reflection on those questions at a local level. And, it might be that there's more available as we enter into the Synod of what's happening and what's being offered to us in terms of the theological input and so on. So there's a real opportunity to accompany and share in some of that journey. The other thing I think we had in Australia was the timing, in one sense, was unfortunate, because we'd had a whole lot of very extensive consultation and participation in that process for the Plenary Council, and the Plenary Council hadn't concluded, and had been in fact extended because of COVID. So there was a certain amount of consultation fatigue, both amongst those contributing to consultation invitations, but also amongst those who were conducting it. So I'd say yes, probably the consultation in Australia for the Synod wasn't as broad-ranging as it might have been in other circumstances for a range of reasons. One of the things that we did to complement that, those circumstances, was to draw deliberately on the sort of contributions that had been prepared for the Plenary Council, which had a very similar sort of question that was being asked.
I have a number of questions about the faith people have in their bishops to deliver the outcomes of the Synod, and how we can have confidence in what someone's termed here the synodal pathway. And Rod and Susan say, given from the grave that Cardinal Pell's writings told the world that the Francis papacy was a catastrophic disaster and that the synodal way was a waste of everyone's time. Jeff writes, similarly, there are many church leaders who in good faith believe that Pope Francis's emphasis on synodality is very harmful to the church. Cardinal Pell used words like catastrophic and devastating, and said that we need to go back 100 years and have bishops and priests pass on the unchanging truth. Jeff's question is, what's the best approach to dealing with such significant differences of opinion? Now, it's clear from our conversation already, we know that there will be extraordinarily divergent paths undertaken. We know that with the cultural influences that delegates will bring from different parts of the world, the different cultural mindsets they'll bring with them on things like women's role in the church, like the role of people who are non-heterosexual, for example. How is that resolved, and how does that devolve down to the parishes?
So there's a few things I'd say. One is, regardless of the views of a whole range of people, some of which have been very, very vocal, and this is happening. And as I said in some of my comments earlier, once this happens this way in Rome, you can't put that genie back in the bottle. You can't have another synod, another council at the universal level, or indeed at the local level, that ignores the changes, the fundamental changes that Pope Francis has introduced into the process. Yes, there will be tensions, and Pope Francis has been very deliberate about making sure that those tensions are there inside the hall as part of the assembly, not to set up a fight, but because we need to listen. I mean, some of the reflections that he's offered on dialogue, yes, speaking courageously, but being prepared to listen humbly to people who might have very divergent views from us. So that's part of the experience, part of the training, and part of having tents that include a space for tension, but in that tension, provide a shelter and a way forward. And it doesn't, it's always very tempting to say, to blame the bishop or to blame the Pope or whoever. Bishops have some capacity. I'm discovering the limits to a bishop's capacity, a bishop's powers as I live it out more. Bishops certainly have capacity and authority and responsibilities, and can be very significant, especially to slow things or indeed to stop things. In fact, that's much easier as a bishop, I'm finding, to do. It takes much less energy to slow something than to actually get something going. That takes a lot more energy and effort and planning. But it's not. We don't have to sit and wait for bishops to take an action in order for actions to happen in our church. To be converted, well, this is one of the points of that slide around the conversion. Each of us is called in each part of the church that we're involved in to take that synodality seriously, which is around participation, it is around co-responsibility, it is around courageous speaking, but it's also around humble listening. How do we engage with tension? So how do we move from a situation that's the adversarial trying to win an argument to the seeking together for a path forward? So yes, there are things that you need your bishop in order to do, but there's a whole lot of things that can happen and that are happening at parish or at a discussion group or at various other associations that people are part of.
Just before we leave those questions around inclusion, a couple of other thoughts. Gloria says, did I miss some details? I didn't notice any African or Asian languages. I didn't either. I wondered that too. And Gloria says, Africa has one of the largest growing Catholic congregations. At least 3 of the priests in our diocese are from Africa, 2 from India and Sri Lanka. Barbara asks about papers being Auslan in Australian Sign Language. So have there been limits placed on the accessibility? Has there been an attempt to find lingua franca?
I don't know. They're running, if I remember right, it's 5 official languages, and then adding German for the is it for documents or working groups? No, I don't think there's German working groups.
Yeah, Joe did ask whether there was a German language group.
Yeah, no, I don't think there is. And part of that would reflect the experience that certainly I had when I was at the German Assembly. English is a language they're very comfortable with. Yeah. So, I mean, they've got the challenge of how do you do this logistically, and how do you, particularly in the working groups, try to allow for enough diversity that there are multiple voices while ensuring that everybody can participate in an active way. So we've all had and so the presumption, I suspect, is that from Africa and Asia, while not everybody on the ground might be comfortable with one of the official languages, but that those who are coming are very likely to be comfortable operating in those languages. We've all had a questionnaire along with asking us to nominate our preferred worksheets, also to nominate our preferred languages. And there's space for comments. And so if somebody had particular needs, and it also included space for if you had particular disabilities that needed to be catered for. Yes. So if somebody had a particular need around a language and that wasn't going to work, there has been space for people to pass that in.
And I am having a number of questions here around this question of diversity and accessibility in all kinds of different ways. Michael again writes, as a gay Catholic, I belong to a group that's traditionally not been heard, a group that's talked about, not spoken with, and I'm struggling to see how this will be any different. I don't see that this has happened in Australia. By contrast with that, and I'm just scrolling down to some of the other comments that we've received, I've got a comment from somebody who says, I'm sorry, but sin cannot be blessed. Women can't be deacons or priests in persona Christi. I pray for the souls of those that wish to attack the deposit of grace handed down by Christ to his apostles. God will not be mocked. Barbara again comments, how do we demonstrate that we're walking together with people with different abilities? And someone else asked when the Australian bishops will welcome LGBTQIA plus Catholics, as Francis did, and that the question wasn't answered. I think we can see there, Bishop Mackinlay, that an enormous diversity of people expressing opinions simply in the several hundred people that are now gathered together in this webinar. A number of questions, though, about how synodality actually works at diocesan levels. Brian asked, does synodality at a diocesan level look like diocesan pastoral councils sitting down with diocesan personnel and groups such as the Council of Priests to listen to each other? And I have had a number of other questions about the extent to which synodality requires listening as well as representation, if I can summarise it like that.
Lots of things I could pick up there. I'd just say in terms of those hot button issues of women's participation in ministry, the openness of deacon, priest, etc., to women, and the LGBTIQ, they're both there explicitly as questions for the Assembly to consider. So they're on the agenda. Yes, listening as well as well. I don't think representation is the word that I'd come to. Space for participation and co-responsibility. I've made very clear to the members of my diocesan pastoral council that they're not there as representatives. They have been drawn from each part of the diocese. They put in expressions of interest, and it arose. That all happened after we'd had our assembly of people from all the parishes and schools in the diocese. That their role is not to represent a particular group or a particular space. It's that together they represent the people of God, and so together they need to have something of that diversity, and they each have the responsibility of listening to all of the people of God in whatever context they might find themselves. And yes, one of the things that we worked out in the 3 years that we took to initially do a review and then planning and consultation was how the Diocesan Pastoral Council would sit in relation to the College of Consultants, the Council of Priests, the Finance Council, and a periodic synod. I think that's critical because, especially from where I sit as the bishop, there's no point for me in having 6 different consultative groups who each want to say something, and rightly want to say something about a particular issue, but who aren't talking to one another, who haven't got a connection to one another. Now, I don't think that means that you lump them all in together. You need to have mechanisms because there's particular roles for each of them. But you do need to have mechanisms where they can be informed by one another and can hear one another.
There are a number of questions about how this is all enacted among the laity. Peter and Helen ask, what are the next steps for the laity? Graham says, the Vatican working document for the continental stage set out some 109 issues. Moving forward, how do you see this document guiding or not guiding the discussion of local assemblies? How do the issues in this document form the basis of discussions moving synodality forward? And what's your guidance for the conduct and involvement of local assemblies involving lay people?
So I'd say it's a resource. If it works, use it. It's there. It's a wonderful document. Use it if it gives life to a group that you're part of. Equally, you could take the worksheets. I mean, the questions have only multiplied. If there were 109 in enlarge the space of your tent, there must be 200 or 300 in the working document. So there's plenty of material to go on with, and then I would expect that part of what we will arrive at after this first assembly will be a document that includes not just questions, but some response to those questions and a process for discerning and reflecting on those responses in the local church. So watch this space. it might take them a little while. And as I say, I think they're in the very best way making it up as they go. So exactly what that looks like, I think, is not clear yet, but that's where we're heading. And so at this stage, you could certainly profitably revisit the document for the continental stage. You could, as we move through the assembly, pick up some of the worksheets. They're wonderful reflections. Each of them has at the beginning a theological reflection on the area it's looking at, and then all the series of questions that have been raised in that space. So there's lots of material to work with, and I suspect that the theological and scriptural input that we receive will be more broadly available. So you could sort of accompany us through the journey of the assembly, and then there will definitely be a process for participating either in something set up locally or directly at a national level through our website into the process of reception and reflection over the 12 months between the assemblies.
Some more questions about the structure of the church and its capacity to respond to the kinds of challenges we've been discussing. Michael makes the point that one of the major challenges facing synodality is the split between the old and the new with regard to what we mean by mission. He says the old tends to reflect a belief that mission equates with evangelisation and in stemming the flow of Catholics out of the church while focusing on new converts, and a new focus that concentrates on renewal within the church, so we're not distracted by numbers and instead express fidelity to the mission with an emphasis on justice in the church. And Pascal also asks about renewing our structures. The model of church used for hundreds of years has been that of an institution with stress on structural elements, especially the hierarchy. Does that model express the theology of Vatican II, that church is the people of God? Do we perhaps need to change the conversation, look less at the church as a structured institution with a certain hierarchical set of beliefs and more as a community of faith? Is that perhaps one of the ways forward for the synodality that you've been discussing at parish level, small Christian communities?
So two questions there. On mission. I'd be going for both and. There clearly needs to be something around evangelising and about encouraging people to participate in the life of the church. But alongside that, and there's no reason for it to be either or, is something about renewing the church, justice in the church, and the church as an agent for justice in our world. And I think if you look at Pope Francis's documents around mission, that Evangelii Gaudium, that sort of thing, that's the sort of direction you'd see there. And then in terms of the structure, as soon as you have a human group, you need a structure. Every little local tennis club has got a constitution and office bearers and chains of authority, a whole set of rules about who can use the courts and when and who's got to clean up, etc., etc. So we're not going to get away from structure, and we shouldn't. We're not just a crowd. We are an organisation. We are an entity, and if you're going to have an organisation, then you need to have a structure. What sort of structure that might be, and how people experience it, that's the live question. And I think one of the most helpful ways for thinking about synodality, and you'd get this set out really well in a dense but accessible document from the International Theological Commission in 2017 on synodality, is that synodality is about what the structures best might be if we are going to live out the ecclesiology of Vatican II. That is the ecclesiology of a people of God who are on a pilgrimage that is a mission entrusted to us on the day of our baptism. Very deliberately, so structures matter, but you do the structures and you make your decisions around structures in the context of communion and mission, and that's why and I think really helpfully, and insightfully reordered the three subtitles so that we start with communion, then we address mission, and then, having had that reflection about the relation between communion and mission, of this pilgrim people of God responding to the gospel call that we've been entrusted with, what sort of structures and processes are appropriate for that sort of people?
And look, a passing comment from Michael, who says, I'm becoming more concerned that this process is even more bureaucratic than ever before. My greatest fear is that this will result in a loss of momentum and that Catholics on the ground will lose faith on the whole process. I do just want to turn to the outcomes. Margaret asks whether it's possible that the proceedings could be put under the pontifical secret, La Croix Internationale, but a number of people are asking, being listened to, being heard is one thing. What's been suggested about what follows on from that? Have the next stages been tentatively elaborated? Listening plus what? We've had a lot of listening. When do we get to the action part?
So that was what I was pointing to in the elements in the Instrumentum Laboris, which say that this is the point at which, while we certainly need to keep making sure that we are listening, that we do move to proposing actions. That's explicitly there as part of our task. And I would imagine that that's part of what that fifth segment is looking to, is to draw that together in a way that can then be offered back to the local churches. So this is the time where we move to action, to responding to some of those questions, not just listening to the questions, the concerns and the hopes. In terms of the secrecy, there will be confidentiality. That's already very clear, just as there was at the plenary council. And the primary reason for that will be to preserve people's freedom to speak freely and openly in the assembly. It's been made very clear to people that, as it was at our plenary council, anyone is free at any time to say anything about their experience of the synod or about what they have said themselves, but that they will be asked to make a commitment not to share what other people have shared in their working groups. It's not clear yet what the protocol will be about what happens in the plenary sessions, but I would expect that the final outcomes, up until the last synod or the one before that, the final document was never published. Pope Francis said, not only are you going to publish it, but you're going to publish the number of votes for and against each paragraph as well. So I would expect that the transparency is only going to increase from that rather than decrease.
I have a number of people asking whether it's possible to access the worksheets or the documents. Is that something?
Yeah. So it's all in the Instrumentum Laboris. So the Instrumentum Laboris is about 50 pages, and it's downloadable at the Synod website, which is www.synod.va. Synod.va. You'll find all the documents there in multiple languages.
Christine asked an interesting question on this, and perhaps on the outcomes. Given the indefectibility is the word of the church is guaranteed by the Holy Spirit, not by intellectual discussions put forward by any party, do you feel the church is growing to be more universal in cultural, geographic and diverse lay and clerical charisms and spiritualities since Vatican II? I guess this is a question about progress and change.
I'm just busily looking up indefectibility.
So I'm not absolutely sure what that means either. However, I think we get to Christine's question.
So the online definition I'm getting is something about not subject to failure or decay. That doesn't mean it's not changing, of course. And this is part of both the being a pilgrim people and the humility of knowing that if we're not at the final destination, we haven't got the final answer. We can offer the best response that we can make to our times and our context and the questions of our situation. But that's not, just as we now are drawing on and enriched by and shaped by the responses of generations that have gone before us, and we build on that. We don't make a new start. We have the humility too, not only to say we're not at the end of the road, but we're not the start of the road. We're just the latest comers. We're the custodians for this time. We don't make a clean start. We draw on the riches of that. And at the same time, we're ready to move forward in ways that where it's clear that we're called to move forward to respond in different ways or to new challenges.
Angela asks, looking forward, what is the anticipated endpoint of the process? Do these recommendations become church practice, church law? What do they become and how will they be implemented?
Well, it will depend on each of them. Just as with the plenary council, different decisions and different recommendations and affirmations have been directed. If you look at the implementation plan, which is available on the plenary council website, you'll see that different decisions have been directed to different bodies according to what they are. It's one of the very interesting things, I think, about the task that the working document, the Insurmountable Laborers, explicitly puts before us, is to decide at which level particular decisions, particular issues should be considered and decided. So one of the outcomes should be that some things are referred back to local, national or diocesan or indeed parish level. So there won't be a one size fits all in terms of outcomes.
Before I hand over to Francis Sullivan, which I'm going to do shortly, despite the fact there are dozens and dozens of questions, Bishop Mackinlay, this has been perhaps the most active question session I've ever moderated. And I think that tells you how passionately interested we all are. I've had several questions from people about the voice. Mario Trinidad from Ghana Land says, if Synodality is listening, why are the bishops of Australia not listening to the vast majority of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who want a voice? And Rosemary also asks whether you have a comment on the October 14 referendum taking place during the Synod.
I have looked at the arrangements for absentee voting overseas. And I'm pleased to see that the embassy in Rome will be available for in-person voting. So I've certainly checked that out, and I'm planning to vote yes. I'm very clear about that. The bishops as a group are also very clear that we have made it on a number of occasions, and there's another statement coming out in the next few weeks where we reaffirm again our endorsement of the Uluru Statement. And so the principle of a voice. We're distinguishing between that and this particular proposal for what a voice might look like, because it is a particular proposal and there are a range of views about that. We were hoping that the proposal that was put forward would be one that was put forward in a bipartisan way that could promote unity and draw people together, and would be one on that basis that we could explicitly and officially support as a group. That's not the case, very sadly. And so what we're doing is in the context of reaffirming our support for the Uluru Statement, recognising that people acting in good faith, informed by good principles and the best of intentions towards Aboriginal people, are around us and are quite able to come to positions either for or against the specific proposal that we're being asked to consider. And so we want to respect that, and we're exhorting people to respect the good faith in which people are engaging with that, to listen to one another with respect, and particularly to listen with respect to the voice of Aboriginal people. We listened carefully ourselves before we officially endorsed the Uluru Statement. We waited for the formal advice of the National Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Catholic Council. And in our social justice statement that we've just issued, we're modelling that listening by assigning, I think, a good half of it to directly inviting that council to speak directly in their own voice. And they're very clear about what their view is. Their advice to us has been one that respects the position we've taken in relation to the Uluru Statement and the particular question of the referendum. And I certainly see the very good sense of bishops as a group and in an official way, not getting into the business of telling people which way they should vote in referendums or in elections in general.
And Graham has just posted to agree with you. He feels that not all Indigenous people do support the voice, but he feels the church should have no role in a political matter. I'm just going to finish with 3 summarising comments, I guess, and note that on the numbers in front of me, we have had more than 80 questions, which is an extraordinary flood tide. Elizabeth says, it's good to hear you speak so positively about the outcomes of the plenary council and the ways that voices have been heard in the synodal process. My hopes are shaky at the moment, to say the least. I'm still looking for positive outcomes in practice in parish and diocese. And Elizabeth says that regrettably, she was one of those who did not experience opportunities for consultation for this synod. Peter and Carmel, writing from Wurundjeri land, say thank you, Bishop Shane, for reigniting our connection and engagement with Synodality and the upcoming synod. Thank you also for your active listening to questions from the forum and answering frankly and honestly. Good on you as we will walk hopefully forward. And Angela says we need Bishop Shane in all Australian dioceses. So there's just one of you to go around, and you've got to go to Rome for about 6 weeks. So
I'm not sure I'd wish that on anyone.
Look, I'd like to now bring in Francis Sullivan to sum up some of this evening's vigorous and very diverse conversation. Francis was, of course, a delegate to Australia's plenary councils and well known to many of you for having been CEO of the Truth, Justice and Healing Council. Francis, welcome to you, and may I say that thank heavens you don't have to moderate these questions. It has been a bun run. It's extraordinary.
Thank you, Genevieve, and hello to everybody online. And firstly, thanks to Bishop Mackinlay, as someone had already said, making himself available not only to give us input, but to answer as many questions as possible across a wide range of issues that were very impressive. And I know from my experience with Bishop Mackinlay that he is genuinely passionate about the synodal process, and hopefully he can be a future leader in the Bishops' Conference to bring about the paradigm shift, because that's what we're talking about, aren't we? There's a paradigm shift signalled by Pope Francis that, in a sense, is asking lay people to understand that we are in a mutual relationship with the clergy, and we have an opportunity to claim our baptismal right and to act out of it. But into that reality is our culture. And as some of the questions even indicated this evening, we're coming off a pretty low base here. You know, the trust in the institution is fraying and enthusiasm is rapidly waning. For example, transparency has not been a characteristic of how our bishops have dealt with the laity. They have not shown full transparency, even around the consultation process with the plenary council and all the submissions that were put forward. At times in previous years, when there's been surveys taken, say, of youth and their experience, our bishops never made those things public. Other bishops in other countries did. So our bishops as a collective group are very tentative about the change that could be coming. Some of the bishops and some of the dioceses actually seem to be overtly disinterested in this synodal process. There's a sense that if they don't talk about it, it'll go away. And we've found, of course, that lay people, it depends on your postcode whether you get a fair deal around consultation. Even in the Canberra diocese, the push for a diocesan pastoral council has frustrated so many decent people who have put in so much time and effort at the request of the diocese, only to find that the reports get shelved or another reason for them not being implemented. And this type of culture undermines goodwill. And synodality relies on goodwill. You know, at the plenary council, we all left with great enthusiasm about our support for the Uluru Statement and the Voice. bishops included. And now we hear them trying to finesse the language because they sniff the breeze and think, oh my God, some of the people don't like it, so we better not get unpopular. That's not leadership. What we're looking for in this moment of synodality is lay people being able to step up with their voice in a mutual conversation. So in conclusion, could I give you a few points that might be helpful? Because many of the questions are saying, what about back here? What about life on the ground for ordinary Catholics? We need to find our voice, and not just our own voice, but voices of Catholics, those that have been dislocated, those that are disinterested, disaffected, but deep in themselves still want to be able to say that they can belong in a Catholic faith-based community. We need to make sure we don't shut down voices out of judgment, out of discrimination. We need to make sure that we check our own implicit biases and create the safe spaces so people in our communities can speak up. We can foster a sense of support. We can encourage people to speak their minds and respect what they have to say, not critique it. We have to resist the ideological filters that we can put through. And at times, when they want it, we can advocate for those who feel speechless, who aren't ready to step up and speak for themselves, but are asking for support. And we, as a lay community, need to learn how to step up and speak out, to support those voices and insist on different voices as well being brought to the table, and amplify the importance of those voices at the table in Zoom meetings like this, through social media, in order so that the episcopal levels of the church can't dismiss us as noise or irritants or not being constructive or being too old or being liberal Catholics or being the past generation. We've got to make sure that Catholic lay voices are given credit for what they say, so they are affirmed, they're encouraged, and we motivate them to continue speaking. In other words, we need to stay in this conversation and explore avenues to develop our points. And that sometimes means harnessing good theological viewpoints that can back in what we're talking about. And that we have to insist that the forums, the councils, the tables that are established, either formally or informally, that we continue to have a proper conversation about the things that matter to everyday Catholics. And those things are reflected in the Synod's working paper. It's a good paper. It outstrips anything that we produced in Australia. It didn't shirk the issues. And of course, we're going to have to wait and see what the process will deliver post-October. And that's why the lay voices around Australia, organised by groups like this one, but also encouraging small cells in your parish or at the coffee shop where Catholics turn up because they don't longer want to go to the parish. Find places in which you can have genuine, meaningful conversations that can lead to providing local support to people, their families, and their circumstances. Always encourage finding common ground. And I then think tentative bishops will have to run along behind us and start rubber stamping, because that's where the movement of Catholics is going. And Pope Francis has often said, we're a movement, we're not an institution. We're inspired and nourished by the Spirit, not by the rules. And the more we grasp that and stand in that reality, believe in it and pray through it, the more we can help create an Australian Catholic Church that relates to the people here. Thanks very much, Geraldine. Thanks again, Bishop Mackinlay. Good evening.
Thank you so much, Francis. And look, I've got a number of people writing to say thank you. Among them, Bernadette, John, who says, thank God we can always rely on Francis Sullivan to speak truth to power. Pia says, thank you for boldly saying how you see things, to which I wholeheartedly agree, including and especially around the Church's lack of words on support for the voice referendum. Vivian also says, you continue to be the kind of leader we need and a dynamic and genuine people of God. Ben says that he is part of the Francis movement, and so does Michael. It's the marginalised and disempowered whom the Gospels impel us to listen to. Widen the tent, listen to the laity, identify the ignored, privilege the crushed, empower the bullied. Thank you for that list of 5 points. Stand up, everyone, and be counted. And Barbara also agrees with you. Bishop Shane Mackinlay, Michael says, thank you, Shane, you're a brave man. So let's hope that the experience that you have in Rome is indeed a powerful and effective one, and that it results in palpable results for ordinary parishioners, those of us who are still in the pews, some people who are clinging on by their fingertips. But we look forward very much indeed to the consequences of that and to understand how that pervades through in our churches. So thank you, everybody. It's been a terrific session, an enormously busy and very energised and diverse one, and a wonderful opportunity to explore the issues that are taking place. Lots of other people saying amen to all those comments. Fantastic close. Thank you for being open to the Holy Spirit, and thank you to the people who said thank you to me as well. I think we are all going out on a note of grace, and at 8:26 p.m. we might close the evening. Thank you very much indeed for your time.